If you have to jump off early, or if you want to show this to your colleagues, make sure to share the recording with them. I will make sure it's uploaded to the YouTube, and I will share the recording via email as well. Um, and just seeing what's in the. Oh, hello, Sarah. Oh, yeah. Oh, there are two Sarahs back to back. And hello, Ashley. Um, but yeah, let's get going with today. So, just a bit about us, both Kelly and Elizabeth. Um, So I'm Elizabeth Clemons. I'm the Director of Training and Enablement here at MuckRock. And that means that, a lot of what I do is what we're doing today. I help out with the different training series that we have, whether they're Investigating with Sunlight series, FOIA Friday, or Building with MuckRock. Also, if you want to schedule a custom training for your newsroom, or your organization, please don't hesitate to reach out. We do custom training. So, for example, if, we delve into court records today and you're like, I really want to do a deep dive on a specific type of court record, we can set that up with your newsroom or organization. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email will be at the end of this session today. So, and you'll get it when I send you a follow-up email after this session. Um, and but otherwise, beyond these trainings, we also have office hours. We held them yesterday, actually.
Yes, can I get a
And
string bean chicken breast bowl with white rice?
um, and in those office hours, we really just love to engage with you. And so please come to those, ready with questions to ask all of the experts at MuckRock. And so a bit about me and my background. I have a background in as an investigative researcher. I've conducted work on gender-based violence in areas of conflict, data privacy violations, and Russian disinformation in American public health systems. And I've worked at the Department of Defense, for U.S. embassies, and at Campaign for Accountability. And then we also have Kelly Kauffman here today. She's the communications and engagement editor at MuckRock. She works really hard to connect MuckRock's work with news, civic, academic partners, and with deeply engaged readers. And she manages the production of MuckRock's newsletter, social media, and communications with the public. Previously, she worked at the campaign finance organization Open Secrets as their outreach and digital media manager, where she helped to shed light on the role of money in U.S. politics. Um, and so, for some brief background on MuckRock, for anyone who is not familiar with us yet, we were founded back in 2010 to support journalists, researchers, and the public at large in filing public records requests. And that's something that we're going to talk about a bit today, too. And we have the mission of, promoting transparency and civic participation. And we build and maintain various tools, which include Document Cloud, and some of you might be familiar with that, and maybe you've used it before. And it's a document analysis and hosting platform that's used by a bunch of newsrooms and organizations. And it's a tool that would actually be super helpful, thinking about the session that we're talking about today. Once you've collected the court records that we're going to dive into today, Document Cloud is a great place to organize and analyze the information you're finding there. Then we also have MuckRock Requests, which is our records request service that makes it really easy to file and track requests. So if you want to become familiar with that, don't hesitate to reach out to me as well. We have a team member who does an onboarding for that. Um, and we also have an editorial side, and that collaborates with other outlets to do records driven work with impact. We also recently adopted the Data Liberation Project. And then we also have the Sunlight Research Desk, which is the result of a recent merger between Sunlight Research Center and MuckRock, which is why we have Investigating with Sunlight at MuckRock now. And if you're interested in learning more about Sunlight Research Desk for your newsroom, it supports newsrooms through research support, expert-led workshops like this one, reporting resources, and a peer-to-peer support network. Yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me to learn more about that as well. But today, let's talk about how court records are a really powerful tool, but they're a powerful tool that can be underused because they can be pretty difficult to understand and figure out where to find. And as we're going along today, don't hesitate to put any questions in the chat. And Kelly and I will flag each other when we see the questions, and we'll try to get to any questions as we're going like through the presentation. And there will also be a bit of time at the end of the session to address those questions. As I mentioned earlier, the session's being recorded. So if you have to jump early or if you have a colleague that wanted to be here today, you can share that with them. Um, if you registered for the session, I'll be sending it to you. If not, it's going to be uploaded on YouTube. I'll also be sending out a tip sheet as well and a link to the PDF of these slides. But let's get going. So let's talk about, why court records matter. And today we'll go into court basics, conducting searches, and public records requests. But yeah, first thinking about why court records matter, keep in mind that litigation forces disclosure. This means that things would never be voluntarily released, like things like emails, contracts, financial strain, internal warnings, and more. They often come out because someone filed a lawsuit. And once they're filed, they become part of a searchable public record. And that's a really powerful tool for journalists. And yeah, a really powerful place if journalists know where to look. And so thinking about some court basics, first, let's talk about there are four main types of court cases, criminal, civil, bankruptcy, and appeals. I'll talk about them each briefly, but today, just for the sake of time, we're going to focus on criminal and civil. But criminal cases are when the government brings changes or charges against a person or a company for violating a law. States charge people in a state court, and the federal government charges people in a federal court. Civil cases are when a person or a company sues another person or company for causing them harm, like physical or financial harm, either in state or federal court. And then there's bankruptcy cases, and this is when a person or a company can no longer pay their debts, so they can file for bankruptcy in federal court. There's no state court bankruptcy, and sometimes creditors can force a person or a company into bankruptcy. For appeals, generally, the losing party in a decision by a trial court is entitled to appeal the decision. This really depends on the type of the case. So, in civil cases, either side may appeal. In criminal cases, however, the defendant may appeal a guilty verdict, but the government cannot appeal if a defendant is found not guilty. Either side can appeal with respect to the sentence imposed after a guilty verdict, though. And then thinking about bankruptcy cases, appeals are a bit more complicated and they involve panels of 3 judges. But yeah, let's talk about criminal cases. And so, yeah, before we go into searching for cases, let's talk a bit more about like examples and what we can find in criminal cases. So I've listed some examples on the slide here. There are way more than just what's listed here. And yeah, as I mentioned, criminal cases are the ones where the government brings charges against a person or company. And they have this at both the state and the federal level. In a criminal trial, the burden of proof is on the government. And so defendants don't have to prove their innocence, and rather the government has to provide enough evidence that convinces the jury of the defendant's guilt. So the standard of proof in a criminal trial gives the prosecutor a much greater like burden than the plaintiff in a civil trial. And so in criminal trials, the defendant has to be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Um, and so when we think about what these criminal cases can reveal, um, I've listed some examples of what they can reveal on this slide here. Yet again, there's more than what I've listed on this slide. But yeah, in general, when we're talking about what court records can reveal, we're talking about something that's pretty fundamentally different from other public records and interviews and documents, And so court records in general, not just criminal cases, they're produced in an adversarial environment, which means that, both sides have something to lose. Statements are made under penalty of perjury and evidence is submitted with consequences attached. And so all of this creates, oh, shoot. Oops. All of this creates like a level of specificity and detail that you don't always get in things like press releases and interviews, or even many public filings, like thinking about different public filings that politicians have to file, for example. Um, but wait, I'm just making sure there's no one trying to join. Wait, great. Um, but I'm gonna make sure everyone's muted. Okay, great. Um, anyways, um, yeah, so criminal cases are unique because the government is involved, as we've talked about and covered. And so these can reveal, law enforcement narratives. And so these criminal complaints often contain things like detailed investigative timelines, surveillance methods, informant involvement, cooperation agreements, and more. But keep in mind, this is the government's version of events. It's not a neutral narrative. Um, this criminal cases can also reveal decision making by prosecutors. They can show why certain charges were filed and why other ones were dropped, and how sentencing recommendations were justified. And so, in general, this can reveal like disparities, discretions, and policy trends. This can also show cooperation and power structures. And so in federal criminal cases, especially, you can see like who cooperated, who received reduced sentences, and who is labeled as like a leader. And these details help to reveal like hierarchy and power dynamics within organizations or within criminal enterprises, if that's what you're looking into in these court records. They also show prior conduct. Um, so that's including things like past misconduct, financial disclosures, and family circumstances. So this can humanize or complicate the story. And it can also provide more like detailed information about the people or the companies or anything that you're investigating. And so we can talk about civil cases now. And so, yeah, as a reminder, as we talked about earlier, civil cases are when a person or company sues another person or company for causing them some type of harm. And so I've listed some examples on the slide here. Yet again, this is not a complete list of examples of civil cases. Um, but yeah, civil litigation is often about disputes between individuals, businesses, or institutions. But from a reporting standpoint, civil cases frequently reveal, internal business practices. And so they can expose how decisions were actually made internally, like within a company, whether executives were warned about risks, internal emails contradicting public statements that are made by companies, financial stress hidden from investors or the public. Um, and employment lawsuits, for example, those can reveal things like workplace culture, repeated HR complaints, retaliation patterns, and prior settlements. And so these are helpful because, these cases can show what an organization tolerates or what they like systematically enable. And that's something, I'm going to be mentioning throughout today's session. And we kind of always mention in Sunlight sessions, like looking for patterns is really key. And that's something that's really key when you're looking at court records, is like looking for patterns and looking for things that are like repeated lawsuits, like repeated lawsuits are definitely a red flag. um, and yeah, something that is worthwhile to like delve into more. Um, but yeah, so as I mentioned, patterns of behavior. One lawsuit could be an anomaly, but 10 lawsuits over 5 years, that really shows a pattern. And so look for things like repeat plaintiffs with similar allegations, similar fact patterns across jurisdictions, serial settlements, repeated contract disputes. And so, yeah, patterns can help you move from like an incident to systemic problem. Um, they can also reveal financial relationships and conflicts. These civil cases frequently disclose things like payment structures, side agreements, hidden partners, shell entities, loan terms, and personal guarantees. And so sometimes you'll see details in a lawsuit that They never appear in corporate filings. And so, thinking about financial disclosures of politicians and public figures again, I mentioned those a bit earlier. This helps a lot to shed light on what's in those financial disclosures. If you're familiar with those, oftentimes they're pretty vague, and they tend to, if they detail a range of assets, like the range in value, big range. And so, oftentimes you can find in these court records a way more narrowed range, which is great. Um, and then it can also show strategic behavior. So it can show who sues aggressively to silence critics, who settles quickly and quietly, who drags out litigation to exhaust opponents. And so just note that litigation behavior in and of itself tells a story. And remember that court records contain material that people never intended to be public, but it becomes public through litigation. And so let's move on to conducting searches. Um, so we'll talk about state in the moment. And when we talk about state searches, that really varies widely. But at the federal level, looking at the structure here, I put this little pyramid. There are district courts, circuit courts of appeals, and then the Supreme Court. Federal courts are searchable nationwide, and I've listed here on the slide some of the resources for searching these federal cases. I won't go into all of them, and these examples and more are listed on the tip sheet that I'll share with you after the session today. Um, Pacer is where federal court records are made available to the public, and you have to create an account. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with it. You have to create an account, and you do have to pay to conduct searches there, and download documents. I'm not going to show a demo of that because you have to pay to do it. But I want to talk about Court Listener, which is a great alternative, and a really good place to start your searches. You can create a profile on there, which allows you to set up alerts and put notes on certain cases. So you can automate alerts through there. And it has a lot of documents there that you don't have to pay to download. And you can put the recap extension on your browser. And so when you or when someone does a search on on Pacer using the recap extension and they download a file, it will get uploaded to Court Listener for you and others to see and access. Both Court Listener with using the recap extension. That's a great alternative to Pacer. But I will keep in mind, or I will mention that you should keep in mind, it doesn't include everything that Pacer has. So it's still really worthwhile to double check if you're missing something. And as a note too, we're creating a really nice like how-to guide and how-to demo video for using Pacer and Recap right now. And so that's going to be coming out within the next month. And for all of you who signed up for this training session today, I'll make sure to send that to you when we have that completed and published. So yeah, keep in mind that we're going to be coming out with that soon. Another federal database to look at is the U.S. Tax Court case search. It's a good thing to check, but it's rare to find cases in this database. And this database, or the U.S. Tax Court, it hears disputes between taxpayers and the IRS, taxpayers as the petitioners and the IRS as the respondent. This court isn't affiliated with the IRS though. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. You pull it up, you can put in someone's name and see if someone's filed like against the IRS. Otherwise, it's good to look at the inmate locators and statewide criminal history checks, and you should all check the National Sex Offender Registry. And these are, just a few of the places you can look. I have more examples listed, as I mentioned, on the tip sheet that I'll be sharing with you all today. But I really want to get into the state searches because that's where things tend to vary. And it's helpful to learn where to search there. But I'm going to take a quick second to look at the chat to see if there are any questions. Okay, cool. And yeah, feel free if you have any questions, throw those in the chat. So When it comes to the structure of courts, it's really, really important to be in the habit of looking up the structure, um, like when you're looking at the state and local levels before you go to look for the case. Um, because this really differs depending on the state and the county, as the Constitution and the laws of the state establish the structure of the courts within that state and county. Um, but generally, within the states, the general structure of the courts, it includes trial courts, appellate courts, and then another layer of appellate, so higher level. It's like the Supreme Court. And so trial courts have indictments, and that's where they have, trial information, and you can find the initial court decisions there. Um, and yeah, these can also be called different things. They can be called circuit or district courts as well. It depends. Um, and yeah, always at the top is the Supreme Court. Well, usually at the top is the Supreme Court. So yeah, just keep in mind it differs depending on the state. Um, and okay, so I want to give you some examples of different states and how they differ. And I also want to point out BRB public record search. That link is listed on the tip sheet. And so that's helpful for you can click on different states and then it will send you to the different counties within the different states. And then it gives you links or sometimes like phone numbers for the different courts there. So that can be a really good place to start, but it's also helpful to do your own independent search to find that. Um, and but yeah, so I want to talk about a couple of different examples for the states. Thinking about North Carolina, for example, court records are available in person at things like, I think they're called like self-access terminals. But then there's also a remote public access program that allows you to get online access of different records. However, to get that access, you have to pay like $495 as a connection fee, and then you have to pay $70 for each user. And then you also have to pay 39 cents per transaction. And given the 500 and the 70 are one-time fees. However, if you're only searching in North Carolina once, that's like a very hefty fee to pay to get like one court case. So I want to mention this is an example of why getting a court runner can be a really helpful alternative. So say if you don't live in North Carolina and don't have the ability to go to one of these self-access terminals, and you only want to access some files, you can send a court runner, and there's also a link on the tip sheet, for court runners that you can access. Um, and Another state example that I want to talk about is New York State. And so I've screenshotted these two examples here. And so New York is also unique. It has two levels of trial courts and 11 different trial courts within those two levels. And the Supreme Court also hears both civil and criminal trials, though most criminal cases are heard in county courts. But when you're searching in New York State, it's really important to look at these two levels of trial courts at both of these two different websites. So there's eCourts and NYSCEF. And so it's important to check both of those databases when you're searching. Um, what is court runner? Um, a court runner is basically a person that you hire to go into the court to pick up the court documents for you. So, for example, in the North Carolina example, that would be someone that you would hire in North Carolina who would go in and pick up those documents for you. How do you find a court runner? There are online websites for that. Um, you're welcome, Ashley. And yeah, so Christine, there are online websites for that. One of them is linked in the tip sheet. And so yeah, you can find one right there. And then same with New York. I've linked both eCourts and NYSCEF in the tip sheet for you to explore. Um, I also want to show you Florida. And so Florida, I just want to pull up here. Here's like Florida court structure. Let me move this around. Where did everyone go? And so here we can see county courts, judicial, courts of appeal, Supreme Court. Always good to check that and then move on to see what else. Um, and so one thing I wanted to point out here is that sometimes when you go online, there are two different places to search for civil and for criminal. And so Miami-Dade is an example of um, a website where there are two different links for civil and criminal. And so, for example, here, when you search county case search, this is civil pops up. Um, and so, which gives you this link. And then if I type in criminal, then you get this link. Um, and so just keep in mind, sometimes you might have to search two different places. And like, let me show you, for example, we're going to go to party name. And the name that I want to look up is, um, wait one sec. Malkin. So you can see here, in the civil database, a court document popped up. However, if you go into criminal and we're going to search, um, same thing, no cases pop up. Um, so that just shows the importance of double checking to see if there are, like, if there are different websites that you should be checking for civil and criminal. Any questions? Okay. Well, then I'm going to talk about some tips for searching effectively. Um, so yeah, pay attention to, I'm trying to move around there we go. Pay attention to these key techniques that I've listed on the slide. Yet again, this is not a full list of key techniques. I've included a longer list in the tip sheet that I'll be sharing with you all. Um, but yeah, remember that there are variations of names, so make sure to search those variations or even just putting in initials when you do the searches. And so if you're investigating a person or a company, make sure that you're keeping track of everything that you're finding and make sure that you're keeping track of everything, not just in these court documents, but in other documents as well. And so going back to Document Cloud, that's a really good place to be putting everything so you can track all of the information that you're finding and kind of like create a timeline, create a web so that you can connect you're going along with research. And yeah, remember that people often hide behind entities. And so this isn't always a nefarious thing, but it's something that tends to obscure identities. So to identify related entities, search the different databases that I've listed on the slide and always search for the individual, any businesses, any parent companies, subsidiaries, and any known associates. And then, you can find these entities that people hide behind and search for those entities in court records as well. And so thinking about some red flags and search results, um, I've talked about, um, oh wait, Ashley, sorry, I'm just seeing your message now. I actually have not heard of Zettelkasten. If you want to put in the chat what that is, I would love to learn about it. But some red flags to think about in search results. I've mentioned patterns. And so things like repeat lawsuits, frequent defendants, bankruptcy filings are another thing that sticks out, cases filed in different jurisdictions, and patterns of settlements. But yeah, just right here, consider what would stick out more, one big lawsuit or 15 small ones. And so keep in mind that investigative stories have begun with a lawsuit that no one else has read carefully. So it is worthwhile to take the time to comb through these documents and see what you can find, because you never know what connections or webs you'll uncover by looking through these. And so, yeah, I want to talk about some of the different documents to understand from court records. Um, and difficult and tedious. Do you have any tips for simple? Ah, like an old school. Cool, Ashley. I didn't know about that, but I'll actually do some research on that, and if I can find any cool links or resources for it, I can put that in the tip sheet as well. Um, but yeah, so thinking about some key documents to understand. Um, yeah, like super depth on all of these because it's quite a few. Um, And if you want to be going in more depth on these, reach out to me and we can set up another training. But, complaints can reveal the narrative framework of the case. They can reveal specific allegations, a timeline of events, legal theories being asserted, um, internal communications, and more, things like financial numbers too. And so, one thing to keep in mind with these complaints is that they're often just one side's version, but they can be really full of leads. And so, it's helpful to treat it as a roadmap or a timeline scaffold for your reporting. And so, here you can pull things like exact dates, names of employees, specific meetings, and references and to documents from these. And so, even if the claims are later dismissed, this claim or this complaint gives you investigative starting points. And wait, um, answers can reveal things like which allegations are admitted versus denied, affirmative defenses, and alternative explanations. And so here you can look for things like partial admissions, technical defenses, claims of arbitration, and statute of limitations arguments. And so keep in mind that sometimes what isn't denied is just as important as what is. Motions, both including motions to dismiss and motions for summary whoa, judgments. These can reveal legal weaknesses in the complaint, jurisdiction arguments, procedural strategies, what facts are being challenged. This can tell you how strong the case might be legally, whether the defendant wants the case to be moving on and gone quickly. That's a motion for dismissal, and what parts of the story are vulnerable. Um, Thinking about motions for summary judgments. These are frequently where, it's like the strongest reporting material can live. That's because in there you can find depositions, internal emails, sworn statements, and different exhibits as well. And so, I'm seeing the chat. And so, anyways, motions and attachments, these often include emails, contracts, text messages, financial statements, and internal memos. Let me pull up the chat really quick. Okay, great. Um, And then judgments, these can reveal who won, on what grounds, damages awarded, and court reasoning. And so keep in mind that a judgment explains how a judge interpreted the facts. And so it can validate claims, dismiss others, and clarify legal standards. It also provides authoritative language that you can quote in your reporting. Um, and then settlements can reveal things like financial resolutions, whether liability was admitted, confidentiality terms, non-disparagement clauses, structured payouts, patterns of resolution. And here you can look for things like repeated confidential settlements, and cases dismissed shortly before trial. And so note that, as I mentioned, patterns matter more than individual settlements, and repeated settlements can show systemic issues. And then lastly, plea agreements can reveal charges admitted or dropped, factual stipulations, cooperation terms, sentencing recommendations. And it's really helpful to look through everything, all of this, and to stay organized. As I mentioned earlier, Document Cloud is a really great way to stay organized and sift through all of this. And so, when you're collecting and analyzing through these documents during an investigation, it's a great tool. Um, and yeah, if you have any questions on using that, feel free to reach out to me. And otherwise, before I turn it over to Kelly to talk about public records, I just want to mention that beyond state and local and federal courts, there are so many other things. They're specialized in alternative legal forums. And so there are a bunch of these ones that I've listed on the slide. I've also included them in the tip sheet and links to them in the tip sheet. And there are more than just what is listed here. And so even, thinking about like the tribal courts, those really vary depending on the nation that you're looking at. Some use an intertribal system, and some have ways to search online, and others don't even have an online database. But yeah, so there are a ton of different options and places to search here. But I will pass it over to Kelly now to talk about some public records.
I think we do have a question from Taylor before we move on.
Okay, let me pull up the chat really quick. How do we get a sense of whether or not, or even when discovery is available to read in a case? Um, that I that's a great question. And my answer is going to be like, it really depends from my experience with this. It depends on the type of case, and like the sensitive materials in it. And it depends on like how far along the case is as well. But that's why things like automating it, like, how I mentioned that you can automate uh, notifications on Court Listener and on US courts with RSS feed. That can be helpful so you can get notifications of when new things are available from cases. Okay, well, I'll pass it over to Kelly.
Great. You just want to hit the next slide, if you don't mind, Elizabeth. Yeah, so when we're looking at, court records, it can be extremely helpful of providing more information for folks, depending on what your reporting is, particularly with criminal cases. And if you kind of want to add additional information that may not be included in court records, we just wanted to provide a few ideas of what you could be looking for once you kind of get some court records and are kind of familiarizing yourself with various cases. I did want to drop this in here. This is kind of what we're going to be talking about, is being able to access certain law enforcement records that can provide a little bit more context to what's going on, police reports, emergency 911 calls. So for example, for 911 calls, it's like, you have an incident, you get the 911 report. You could also be requesting reports about 911 calls around that time if there was anything unusual about this criminal case, or you just want to get a little bit more context as what was happening during that specific time. Finding emergency 911 calls for just the last hour of that can be kind of helpful. Any kind of incident reports, internal affair records, inspection reports. These are a lot that deal with law enforcement and be able to help with sometimes these criminal cases, and just being able to understand a little bit more of what you're kind of looking for. And in this guide, we have some tips and tricks, because law enforcement can be a little bit of a trickier area for folks. If anyone has done that and gotten records from police departments or have attempted to, everyone knows there's a lot of bumps in the road with that. So just being mindful of making sure you're narrowing your request, you're doing as much as you can to help yourself to get some of these records back. And I think it really helps with, looking at timelines and be able to provide a little bit more context. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, we can go to the next one. So I think with that, it's really just finding more context than what's in a court record. So, you could see as a court record as a jumping off point for more investigative reporting, particularly public records, and finding things to look out for, any kind of discrepancies between what's happening in the court narrative, from the parties versus what's happening perhaps in a 911 call. Missing reports, maybe they say that something exists when it doesn't. Any kind of important redactions. Officer accounts can be differing between maybe what they have internally and what they're telling the court. That can be a treasure trove of information, and also timeline conflict. So that's why we're saying things like, inspection reports, 911 calls, incident reports. So just being able to match up timelines and seeing if that's, how that was projected in a court record, or is that a little different from what the police has said? So just, being able to expand out a little bit, and just really kind of bettering your reporting by getting a little bit more information from different perspectives. Yeah. I don't know if we have another slide. Okay. And then also, just so you know, we have a lot of our guides about not just law enforcement records, but emails, text messages, all of that, where they can be helpful for these scenarios. So we can send those out when we send the tip sheet, but just being able to know that, public records can kind of be expanded out, that you find one little nugget of information that can lead to something else. So that's why we also say, just as a general rule for all of our FOIA workshops, is that's why you kind of want to get narrow, because then you can always ask for more information and uncover a lot more in that process. But if there is a specific question you want to ask, or if you're working on something, some reporting that you don't really want to say in front of a bunch of people, that totally makes sense. But there's our emails, just in case you guys have any additional questions.